Well, all right. We're going to have that conversation today amongst ourselves, but then also bringing in the executive director of Transparency International, that is Sheila Masinde, as well as an advocate of the High Court, legal and political analyst and advisor, Dr. Alutalala Mukwana. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning. Good morning, City. Good morning, Ndu. And Shiro, good morning.
Morning, Sheila.
Morning, Sheila.
And morning, Dr.
Good morning, Dr. Mukwana. Good morning to you too as well, Dr. Miss Masinde. All right. So
Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning.
All right. So as we start this conversation this morning, I guess just jumping in right into it, and we can start off with you, Sheila. We've been having this conversation for some time over the last few days. I mean, and of course, there are many who've been plunged into this conversation in the last few months. And if we're looking at this now, how far does the IMF program actually go in dealing with budgeted corruption? And maybe, first of all, before we go there, let's unpack this budgeted corruption a little bit. And what exactly does it mean when we're talking about budgeted corruption? And then further on, has the IMF actually tackled that issue with this program?
Thank you very much, Ndu. Budgeted corruption really is that phenomenon where, as we are planning, for prioritizing public projects and earmarking expenditure, we are also seeing a case where budgets are generally being padded. And in fact, it's none less than the previous Auditor General, Eddie Owuko, pointed to this rising trend. Whereas we're budgeting, we're seeing that budgets are becoming increasingly, marked up, particularly for development projects. We've also seen that in this country, even as you look at our debt crisis, you can basically grow an excess, because in the last 8 years we've seen a flood or a deluge of more expensive commercial and bilateral debt in the country, and a good chunk of this debt has been directed towards the development of can I call it very flashy, shiny presidential flagship projects, and several of which have been cited in the Auditor General's report, and being deemed as examples of budgeted corruption. And we've seen a lot of costly and risky investments without transparency in those processes or in decision making, and this really increase the opportunity to budget for corruption as you're budgeting for development. You can almost call it debt designed to be stolen, because in this budget we are operating on a deficit. So we have to obviously borrow that money, but by the time you're borrowing that money, you know that as it comes, we are also borrowing to steal. Yeah? So we are basically fastening the cow for eating. And yet, as we have been trying to basically call that, the budget must be transparent. It must be an open process, and so must be the process in terms of acquiring debt. But in our current situation in Kenya, where the budget process hasn't been what I can call fully participatory, fully open, and as well as the debt acquisition, debt utilization, reporting processes, then we can obviously see that there's been an attempt to basically try to budget, for pilferage. That's my layman's explanation of budgeted corruption.
And has the IMF, I think working on an assumption as well that the IMF is fully aware of this program, is aware of the fact that these things happen. Has it done enough? Because there are different conditionalities that come with the money. There are certain things that are suggested that you must do as a country when they give you these funds and concessions. Have they dealt with this? Has the program dealt with this? Made a suggestion to say that this must also be tackled?
Well, I tried to look through the entire program, including the commitments that have been made by the Kenyan authorities, and also there's a memorandum of financial and economic policies that the government has put forward, and this is a technical MOU, where now the government has put in place the commitments. Particularly, I was looking at the commitments made towards building a strong anti-corruption framework. but also just looking at some of the mechanisms or proposals they've made towards ensuring fiscal transparency and better public finance management practices. I just know that throughout the document there's a risk management plan and analysis for the plan, of course. But I noticed corruption is not really mentioned as among the risks, that there are risks to achieving or attaining a positive economic outlook, at least not explicitly. They talk about political risks, they talk about, expected weaknesses in state-owned enterprises, and also risks for poor implementation, and the capacity of the government to be able to implement some of those measures, and also fiscal pressures in the run-up to the election and so on as we go towards 2022. But I've not seen anything explicit on corruption. And yet we know that even in the current situation, the current challenge that we have now with the COVID pandemic, it has increased the risk of funds being lost to corruption or captured by elites. Of course, it has also reduced oversight that we would get from, say, the mandated institutions, but also civilian oversight. And therefore, powerful actors may use this crisis for their own benefit. And now we are getting additional, those additional resources through that facility from the IMF. But how do we ensure that we block all those loopholes so that, so-called powerful actors do not use that crisis to benefit, to make personal benefit out of this pandemic. I think if you look at the document, maybe just to summarize now, is that the government has made certain, commitments and put forward certain priorities towards enhancing the anti-corruption framework. They've talked about, promoting fiscal transparency, publishing procurement information, including beneficial ownership data of companies that have been added to operationalizing access to information, which is really key in terms of giving Kenyans, budget information. What in time. Because another thing is having that information and ensuring that it's there in time. Kenyans can also scrutinize these figures that are being put forward in terms of what government projecting to spend on what activities and projects, so they can be able to scrutinize. These figures. Has there been any padding? To kind of enable people to steal. So the operationalization of the access to information law, which was passed in 2016, is important. We know that currently we don't have any regulations, and so I've seen that the government has committed towards expediting those regulations, which have been pending for some time. They've also committed towards reviewing the current legal review framework for asset declarations for senior public officers, and also the conflict of interest rules. There's a big bill currently, which has kind of taken about 2 years or so, which has been pending. So I think they've made commitments towards, putting in place conflicts of interest rules. And then, of course, there are things we talked about in terms of anti-money laundering and combating financial terrorism and so on, which helps to combat concerns around illicit financial flows and so on. But I've looked at, despite this commitment, maybe what I can say is that I have not seen any expenses for some of the issues. Like for instance, for public procurement, there are timelines that have been given. The government has committed this by the end of this year, that's December 2021, that there will be improvements to the public procurement portal. Because we've been talking about ensuring that it actually complies with open contracting data standards, and that we are able to get information on beneficial owners of companies that have been contracted. And I am aware that CPRA has been basically even working with partners like us as well to try and improve that system. And so they've given a timeline of December, which is good.
Okay.
But in some of these commitments that have been made, we don't see any timelines, which would have been good also for the IMF to publish in this program. They've talked about, performance monitoring and criteria to use for performance monitoring and periods when they'll be able to monitor. But in terms of timelines for some of these commitments, that will have been good to have, so that even as Kenyans were able to follow through some of these processes.
Okay.
I also note that the program doesn't really quite adequately address the political economy that is likely to frustrate measures for transparency and accountability, which are really critical for the success of the program. And still, when it looks various proposals, the government has made various proposals, but it leaves the the architecture of state capture intact. The program kind of takes a business as usual model, where those as I think Sheila has kind of alluded for the systemic violation of the public finance management principles, are then charged with this crisis. But then how do you ensure accountability to this extent? I also note that it doesn't take effective public participation. As I mentioned, this is four principles: access to information, public participation, public engagement, for civilian oversight. Yeah. Then that it then brings to a court tenants that severity of being able to oversight and also resolve the current and also data how the government is particularly going to use these funds to use. There's also that question of parliamentary approval, and I know you're talking about this data, but I just think that there's also nothing in regards to the role of parliament.
Well, even as you asked that question, I think I wanted to ask Dr. Alutalala this question now in terms of, on a national scale, what is then the role of Parliament in making then sure that some of these things are actually addressed, that these issues of corruption that we continue to talk about, that are budgeted for, that are actually addressed by Parliament? What is the role of Parliament in these processes?
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to my fellow co-panelists. I am a bit worried by the fact that IMF has proceeded to grant the facility regardless of what it is that is prevalent in the country. Before I talk about briefly the oversight role of Parliament, allow me one or two statements here to make.
Sure.
And say this. For whom does IMF act? If indeed IMF acts in the best interest of the citizens and the population of the country, and in the interest of the macroeconomic stability of the nation, then that leaves us with a few questions. Number one, the conditionalities that they are putting up front ought to make sense if IMF was the stranger in Jerusalem and therefore did not know what it is that is happening in this country. When they talk about various legislations, such as the conflict of interest rules, and etc., it is very clear that we have legislation that on its own, if implemented and if adhered to, this ought to have addressed the budgeted corruption mess. The Public Finance Management Act, for example, is very clear. It requires all public finance to be managed in tandem with the provisions of the Public Finance and Management Act. It has been flouted time and again. When the conditionalities by the IMF talk about the beneficial owners of the companies being non-upfront, in other words, in law saying that they will now lift what we call the corporate veil of the companies. This sounds sweet, but for God's sake, hasn't the IMF just witnessed several companies swindling billions of the COVID-19 funds, and the Kenyan government not doing anything to unmask the corporate veil of those beneficial companies to know who it is that is behind it?
Is that enough for them to stop it? I mean, just before you go to your second point, sir, is that enough then for them to say, well, then we're not going to give this money? Because if you look at the origin of this fund, it is to do just that. And if you're asking the question that where is their interest then lies in what they were initially constituted to do. It doesn't come along with then caring about the countries that they're giving these funds to, really about what they do with them. They can set conditionalities, they can, set certain preferences, but at the end of the day, is that what they were set up to do? Should they be then really concerned and say, well, if you're not worried about corruption, if you're not sorting it out on a national level, then we will not then give you the money? It flies in the face on what they were originally constituted to do.
Absolutely. And that is what I'm going to as a third point. But a bit of history, it will be very important. you must understand that the IMF of the 1990s, during President Moi's reign, the IMF, which was intrusive, which was pervasive, and which would actually, roll up its sleeves and ensure, for example, what they termed then in the 90s, the structural adjustment programs.
Yes.
Which required, for instance, that the government must reduce its recurrent expenditure. And it saw the government send home a number of civil servants in what came to be known as the retrenchment programs. That is not the IMF of today. Remember, the IMF of then was working strictly in furtherance of democratic space, human rights, good governance, and so forth. Today, what I see the Bretton Woods as institutions trying to do is to try and do a catch-up game with China. China is in Africa, and it is big. China feels and hears nothing about good governance, about good, proper fiscal management, sustainable development. That are alien statements for China. And therefore, if you look at the IMF of today, you realize that even on their own page, if you read, they say that they had to review their conditionalities to be in tandem with the dynamics of today. Those dynamics are, in my view, that the IMF and the West may not prefect of developing countries that want aid. And therefore, what IMF, in my view, seems to be concerned about is ensuring that one nation, for example, Kenya, in a region, does not completely go into crisis, and therefore those ripple effects affect the neighbors and the international monetary institutions and the international financial market adversely. So, in my view, the IMF seems to be concerned more with the macroeconomic situation of the country as opposed to the microeconomic situation of the country. If they were concerned with the micro, they would then descend to the arena in this country and ask themselves, only a few months ago, Kenya was a beneficiary of billions, ladies and gentlemen, billions of COVID funds. Those COVID funds have not been accounted for. They have not been only accounted for, but Kenyans have died in queues and in isolation centers because the support that was sent by the international community did not reach the intended recipients. So the IMF really is interested in the larger picture. The IMF is not interested in descending to the arena, soiling their hands and saying, look, we are not going to give you this money until you play ball. And if you look at it finally, so that I give my fellow panelists to have a go at this, whom does IMF listen to? If IMF ever listened to the ultimate consumers of this fund, to the ultimate recipients of this fund, the people and the citizens of the country to which their donations are intended, the online petition against this disbursement would have pricked IMF's conscience. So in my view, it is the big boys who are being slapped on the wrist, and the rhythm of corruption and strangulation of the people's lives continues. I thank you.
Dr. Muhwana, thank you. I actually, well, let me say, I love listening to what you're saying, but having loved listening to what you're saying, allow me to ask you a question or two. From what you're saying then, would I be wrong if I summarize it by concluding that all you've said is that we are on our own as citizens?
Thank you.
My name is Muga, C.T. Muga.
Thank you, Mr. Muga. And thank you for your kind words. Mr. Muga, I can't emphasize enough. I have always said in this country that the biggest enemy of us is us. For as long as we feel that we'll only turn right if the politicians say turn right, turn left if the politicians say turn left, we are on our own. And nothing emphasizes this better than the speech of the president yesterday in Kisumu and his tirade against the judiciary, only a day to when we have the judiciary assembling their team to listen to a petition in which the president has a direct interest. Yes, we are on our own. Thank you.
Well, the president is consistent because in 2017, he sang a similar song. So, with regards to the president expressing his view, I have to ask this question. When we judge him, are we judging him as Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta? Are we judging him as a president? Are we judging him as a citizen of the country? And are we saying that he doesn't have a position as a president to express his own personal views?
This is Kenya's biggest conversation. It is the Situation Room, and we are looking at budgeted corruption today in light of what is happening with the first tranche of funds that are coming into the country via the IMF. And we're having this conversation this morning with the Executive Director of Transparency International, Sheila Masinde, as well as an advocate of the High Court and a legal and political analyst, Dr. Alutalala Mukwana. Thank you for again having this conversation with us, and we're just going into that CT as we were going off into that break, saying on a national level these demands or these responsibilities that we are talking about right now, how far does the president, does the government have a role to play in all of this?
Well, the government actually, it is their mandate. And we talk about them being given the mandate by the Constitution and by us, the owners of the country, to actually manage these affairs on our behalf. And if you give someone oversight, then it means that you are also required to hold them accountable. And some of these questions that I think are being raised are precisely that. But why I made the statement stating that it appears that we are on our own is this. There's a discussion, and has been for the longest time, about a certain state of helplessness that Kenyans are in. And I want to disabuse that Kenyans are not really helpless. When you have a lovely population like ours who are willing to follow you and to be compliant with what you say, it doesn't mean they're foolish or they're stupid or they're uninformed and that you can continuously take advantage of them, because this is what we seem to see at play. But this is then my question. We say we're helpless, but are we really helpless? And in my view, the answer is no, we're not really helpless. We have chosen to be bystanders and watch our lives crumble before us, but it doesn't mean we're helpless. The question that I would like to ask is, even as we get this money, we keep talking about the president. Let's leave the president aside. Because there are times when I think the issue doesn't really fall squarely in the lap of the president. We have a budget-making parliament. They are supposed to do what our courts have now done, to take the executive back to the rule of law and say, excuse me, this is what the law actually says about these issues. You'll have issues, but this is what it says. If Parliament had played their role as they ought to, and actually provided that oversight, which the judiciary really can't. The judiciary wait for issues to get to them. Parliament are even in the process of creating these laws and rules. They have even more power. Now, we also have the power to elect, but we also have the power to hold our leaders accountable. Now, Sheila, this is to you. Transparency International. What exactly does Transparency International do with regards to ensuring that the citizenry really understand all these things that we discuss in a forum such as this one, and we appear to understand, and to the point where they can take these issues to the level that they can? Forget the presidency. The Mwananchi can access their MP. The Mwananchi can access their MCA. How far does Transparency International go in ensuring that the Mwananchi has the information and the tools by which they can actually hold their leaders accountable?
Thank you, Citi. I wish you had asked me first to talk about the role of Parliament, because I think maybe I can just highlight that, first of all, we really need to, and that's one of the things we're trying to do with this, adding the whole Parliament to account and demand that it really its mandate in ensuring that the country's obligation remains sustainable and that information on debt is available, updated, and accessible by all citizens, and also to raise awareness among citizens on the role of Parliament in terms of exercising oversight in contracting debt, because it's clear in many cases Parliament has not been involved or has not been better, even where yet, even in terms of where some of this, we've seen the CS, Treasury, and other officials, coming before Parliament, but there's a feeling that Parliament has really not gone hard in terms of holding them accountable on behalf of citizens who have elected them. Parliament has also not done much in terms of, tapping the country's debt ceiling as far as money. And so we've also been trying to raise awareness among citizens on the role that Parliament has to ensure that the country's debt obligation is not too high to affect the country's ability to be able to pay, and also it doesn't, our debt burden does not add unnecessarily, the tax burden on the citizens. But you see, we've really been concerned that the executive has literally run roughshod. We've gotten Parliament, to increase the debt in time without number. We've also raised awareness among citizens on the role of Parliament in the budgetary processes, so that they're not just used as to just tick the boxes or to just pass these budgets, but to actually scrutinize them, because we're still talking about the issue around budgeted corruption. How are these figures padded so that money is stolen? Directly now, away from Parliament, the role of Parliament and trying to raise awareness amongst citizens in that role so they can hold them accountable, we've also, and working with other civil society organizations, particularly under the Ofa Uchumi coalition, have done quite a bit in terms of just giving citizens information on public finance management, and that includes public debt management. And one of the things that we've even been thinking about is how do we even have a repository or a database of information in terms of just giving the debt information, because that currently, as we speak, the debt register is not up to date as published by the government, and so trying to even look for alternative means to give this information, because as I said, access to information is so critical. To put the power to put the power in the hands of citizens to hold a government accountable. And know exactly here how much money do I really owe, other citizens and other.
Sheila, can I jump in? Jump in, because Citi kind of framed the issue well, and then, what is it we are asking? And where do we want to put the onus for action? Because I think the correct question is, how do we respond to a situation of capture? We are not operating in an ordinary situation where citizens participate and government responds, because citizens are participating. They are making submissions. The Constitution and the laws provide for public engagement forums, and citizens do participate. When they give their submissions and Parliament ignores them, citizens are also going to court. So the question is not public participation. The question is, how do we deal with a government that's captured? And why do we say captured? Because the executive has violated the law. And the only institution standing against that executive is the judiciary. As a result, the judiciary has been defunded. The judiciary gets less than 50% of its required finance. And if you look, the judiciary allocation has not gone up in the last 4 years. Parliament's and executive allocations are going up. So the executive is actually squeezing the judiciary. So what has Parliament done? They are in bed with the executive. So the question is not public participation, because public participation cannot undermine that that collusion between the executive and Parliament. It cannot. So the question we must ask, because now we have also heard IMF is not going to save us. IMF's interest is global. They are actually looking at the global financiers getting their money back. They are looking at making sure the Western governments have a footprint on the continent, and they are competing with China that does not respect democracy. Actually, they are dealing with, a government, a culture that is very much inimical to our interests. So we are alone, and maybe with the judiciary, which is under attack. So what are our options? And I'd like to throw that to Dr. Mukwana, because you put the thesis very well. What do we do? We're in a state of capture.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Wanjiro. And once again, thanks for the Oko Uchumi initiative. Keep fighting, my sister. Before I answer what we should do, give me a second to respond to Mr. Muga's question, which seems to ask whether we are being fair to His Excellency the President, and whether the President is not a private citizen who should then hold private views, an individual and the head of state. Kakangu Muga, the President is all those three. He is a trinity of sorts. Just like the Bible talks of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The President is a trinity. But that trinity must remain the President, not the individual or the private citizen. Because when he ascended to the throne of the presidency of this country, he vowed to relegate his personal wishes and interests and instead uphold the interests of the people of Kenya, defend and protect the Constitution. You are not protecting the Constitution when you lambast the judiciary for upholding the rule of law. And in any case, if you're unhappy with the decision of the judiciary, the law says you appeal. That is what constitutionalism is about. We are a country having constitution but without constitutionalism. The late Professor Okoth Ogendo will remind you. Let me now go to another that he has said, and I really appreciate his thought system here. Are we helpless? And that's where also Wanjiro's question comes in. Yes and no. Kenyans are helpless because, number one, the bulk of Kenyans have been put in a life of no choice. Kenyans have been harangued and subjected to what I call state-sponsored poverty since 1963. When a poor man is cornered and bludgeoned into submission by poverty that is encouraged by the state, a poor man or woman has no choice. So many times when you see the Kenyans in the villages and in the slums queuing behind politicians for 50 shillings, they are helpless because they are victims of an accumulated state-sponsored poverty strategy. But are they completely helpless? Maybe no. Because as a people, we must take a resolve that the lives that we lead and the lives that our children and grandchildren will lead must change. And if there is anything that should make us reach that cliff, is this whole BBI thing. That indeed, leaders have become so shameless that they can take it upon themselves to begin an initiative which is clearly provided for under the Constitution, Article 257 as a popular initiative, and run with it on our behalf without our blessing. And when the court catch them swimming out naked, they have the temerity to lambast the court. What we must do as a civil society, as Kenyans who have been privileged to go to school and have the spine to speak the way we are speaking, because not all of us can speak the way we are speaking, we must not tire. Transparency International, Oko Uchumi, and all those are doing a commendable job. But you must remember the last problem that we heard, that our grandfathers, our forefathers of independence gave us one lasting legacy. I use the term legacy for lack of a better word, and that is tribalism. That howsoever you may speak in this fora, when it comes to politics, everybody, practically everybody, retreats to their tribal cocoon and they vote based on their tribes. That tribal cocoon is precisely our Achilles heel as a people. Because then each tribe has a political bigwig. And it is this political bigwig who is actually tribal bigwig that determines even how Parliament will run, ladies and gentlemen. In Parliament today, the role of Parliament in oversighting government, the executive, is earth-moving, literally, but on paper. It's potentially earth-moving on paper. But in practice, it is the tribal warlords who determine how the voting in Parliament will go. If you doubt this, ask the MP of Ravieda, Senior Council, Molo.
Dr. Mokwana, you mentioned something that I think is vital in all of this, and that is the power of conversation. Because oftentimes, one of the first things that is likely to be muffled is the voice in fights like this. So having the conversation is extremely important in as many places as can be had. But is it enough? And I am asking this because we have very, very many examples of countries the world over who did not stop at having the conversations. Things spilled over. Is talking enough?
Talking is not enough. We must move to action. But again, allow me to juxtapose the civil society environment of today to that of yesteryear. In the yesteryear, the days of the Moi, the civil society talked, conversed, and when it required to move to action, the West was ready to give them the wherewithal that is required. You cannot move to action without funds. You cannot move to action without facilitation, because you are moving against a government that is intransigent, a government that is determined to make sure that civil society space diminishes, a government that buys a few of those civil society people who are willing to be bought, and the government that will make sure that they bludgeon you into submission. Today, the funding, facilitation for the civil society has acutely diminished. And therefore, the civil society is many times rendered into conversing, talking, with very little ability to move into action. That is where the civil society has a challenge. You can ask Wanjiru Giponya, for example. She has to make do with a shoestring budget to ensure that she is heard. Even when it comes to public media like the one we have the privilege to address through today, these are all private businesses. And we speak here on the clear goodwill of the owners of these media. There comes a time towards election time when media take a strategic decision that only personality X will address in our studio. Personality X is a persona non grata. So it is a stifled space. I'm afraid things have really
Dr.
changed.
Dr. Mukwana, listening to you speak, for a moment there you transported me back to the Moi era, and where everything that you're saying was the order of the day. But that isn't true now. I'm not saying this because I'm in the media. I'm saying a conversation such as the one we're having now, there was a time it was virtually impossible, completely impossible. And yet with its impossibility, people were able to raise their voices at great cost to their individual lives, yes. And that cost is what has made it possible for this space that we have. My issue is with all this space, how often do those who voice these wonderful and needful things ensure that these are messages that are not only spoken of, but are crafted so that the Mwananchi actually understands the import of it? This is why I was addressing Sheila earlier on, because I like what they're doing. I like what Wanjiru is doing. But does it really get to, as we say, the ground?
Sheila, maybe you can take that.
Can I-
maybe
can
Sheila,
I
maybe
throw
Sheila
in-
No,
can
no,
take that.
let Sheila. No.
No,
Okay,
let me throw in
Wanjiru.
because what
hold
you're
on.
speaking-
Sheila.
Hi,
what
hello.
you're
Wanjiru.
speaking to- hold on.
Sheila, maybe Sheila can address that because our time is running down. Maybe Sheila can take that question.
You can bring it up later because you're on the show.
Allow me to simply qualify.
Sheila, maybe you can address that question, please.
No, let Wanjiru speak.
10.
Sheila raised the issue of the political economy, which is what CT has spoken to. Because this political economy has civil society, Dr. Muhana has said, also has Western donors, also has the politicians, the executive, and citizens. So Sheila actually said there is a political economy. Muhana has then told us this political economy is aligned against action because donors have aligned against action. So I agree with your question. So as Sheila picks up the question of how do we mobilize the citizens in a political economy where we are actually acting alone for once.
Okay,
in
Sheila,
the
I'd like you to take that question,
we were
please, as
not
we're running out of
acting
time.
alone. The interests were aligned towards removal of Moi.
All right, Sheila.
The forces are now aligned towards the status quo. How do we mobilize citizens in this instance where they are poor, unafraid, and alone?
Yeah, I think that in terms of mobilizing citizens, which a lot of us are already doing, and Wanjiru, you and even Dr. Muhana have really articulated the difficulties that we currently have, even in terms of reaching citizens, in terms of resources and so on. But what many of us are doing and will continue to do is even particularly just even using existing structures. You know, how do we work with churches? How do we work with religious communities and those other, grassroots communities, women, youth, and so on, to be able to mobilize them and outside raising awareness. And I'll probably even touch on that question around, are Kenyans completely helpless? And no. Because as much as, yes, we have the Constitution, which gives all sovereignty to citizens, but the fact is that when we look at this, that it's the same thing with civil society. What space are we working within? The same thing with judiciary. What functional or financial autonomy do they have to be able to operate independently? It's a situation as well with citizens that, yes, you may even have someone who is informed, but then there are those, in terms of spaces, what space do they have to be able to get action? And even when we talk about, for instance, we tell citizens, you have the right to even go to court. But how much does it cost for one to go to court? Even for us, and Wanjiru will tell you, there are many times we've had to resort to take petitions to court, but it comes at a cost in terms of time and resources. So there's that sense of, yes, we are getting that sort of awareness, the tools, the means, and the resources to be able to activate all these things and get citizens to act. But I think in the last few months, we are also positive. Even I think it was speaking on who you're the one who alluded to. It was actually Dr. Muhana who talked about the action on Twitter, the Kenyans on Twitter, the petition.
Yeah.
That was actually an indication that citizens are ready to take action into their own hands.
Well, I think that
we are.
Definitely,
Yeah,
the conversations need to continue, and I think we want to thank both of you for joining us on the show this morning. Dr. Muhana Alutalala and also Sheila Masinde, Executive Director of Transparency International. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Again, a lot of these things we can scratch the surface and go deeper into these conversations, but it's clearly important that they need to be had. Asante sana to both of you today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you very much.